Welcome to Reflections on Water. I'm Dave Ross.
And I'm Anna Wildeman. On today's episode, we interview Ken Wagner. Ken is Oklahoma's Secretary of Energy and the Environment, where he's actually responsible for more than 30 state agencies, boards, compacts, and commissions. I mean, seems like Ken has a lot to do.
Yeah, in fact, we really appreciate Secretary Wagner taking time out of his busy schedule to talk to us. And he spent some time talking about the entire scope of his portfolio, cutting-edge topics in environmental law and policy. He spends a lot of time with us talking about their efforts to diversify their energy economy with a focus on hydrogen. In fact, I think early in the interview, our listeners, Anna, are probably going to wonder whether or not we had drifted from the water obsession in our podcast. But I think folks are going to be surprised to learn about how integrated water is with hydrogen production, and also the crossover between hydrogen and carbon sequestration, which is, as you know, Anna, a program under the Safe Drinking Water Act that was run by our old water office at EPA. It was a great conversation. I'm really happy you took the time to join us.
Yeah, me too. And I think it's even more relevant as we're publishing, even than when we recorded it, given that the administration has just announced that the CEQ is issuing new guidance on the responsible deployment of carbon sequestration technologies. And they've also issued a handful of requests for information about new initiatives under the infrastructure bill to accelerate hydrogen in some of those hard to decarbonize sectors. So, I think it's a pretty good, timely interview. And one question for you, Dave. Do you think there's a little bit of tension between the administration's overall goals with respect to decarbonization and sort of the way that individual agencies are pursuing their regulatory programs and outcomes?
Yeah, I actually do think there's some tension that is going to be interesting to watch. I think the overall administration and, the Department of Energy are focused on hydrogen, for example, carbon capture as part of their climate adaptation strategy. There's a ton of new money in this space coming off the Hill. But I do think they're going to run into some tension at the implementing agencies like EPA, for example, and whether or not they're going to find some hesitancy at EPA to actually permit these new technologies. It's going to be fascinating to watch in the coming year.
I couldn't agree more, and that's really where the rubber will meet the road on these programs in terms of deployment. So I think it was a pretty interesting interview with Ken, and so let's go ahead and roll the tape. I want to welcome to Reflections Ken Wagner. Ken is the Secretary of Energy and Environment for the state of Oklahoma. Welcome, Ken.
Thanks. I am excited to be here and talk about Oklahoma.
Ken, for an Oklahoman, you find yourself in D.C. a lot. What brings you to town this week?
I think supporting all the efforts under the infrastructure bill is going to take us here quite a bit over the next year or so, maybe even before. But our governor also has really challenged each cabinet secretary, there's 15 of us, to at least come and have touch points with your federal counterparts at the various executive branch agencies at least once a quarter. So we were already doing that, particularly since the Biden administration has come in. We had established touch points with the previous administration, and we wanted to establish those again. And I'm also here for a conference of state energy officials. The group is NASEO, the National Association of State Energy Officers.
Yeah, energy is a big business in Oklahoma.
I've heard that.
And when I think of Oklahoma and energy, I think of oil and gas. And actually, if you Google what is Oklahoma known for, you'll find that the internet thinks Oklahoma is known for American football, oil, and tornadoes. So, Ken, is the internet right?
Yes, the internet is right, but there's much more to the story, and as Paul Harvey said, the rest of the story, and hopefully we can give you that today. And I always like to say that when I talk to people, that I want them to leave with the impression of something surprising. When I talk to Oklahomans, I usually try to arm them with ammunition to talk to snooty bicoastal people that want to talk down to Oklahoma about environmentalism.
Flyover country, right?
Well, so I might say that. I'm not sure that's really what I need to say on your podcast, but I think that's the intent. I want to leave the listeners with some surprising facts about what Oklahoma has done to be a leader both environmentally and in traditional and alternative energy space.
Well, we know you're extremely proud about the diversification of the energy portfolio in Oklahoma. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So first I'll tell you how we're trying to brand ourselves. At one point we were the quote oil capital of the world, right? And that title's long since passed. We'll never be the energy center of the world. But when you think about Oklahoma, we can be the energy innovation capital of the world. And, we've already proven that through history, right? There's Oklahomans who literally changed the world's economy and the trajectory of how the industrialization of our nation happened. And that was, people like the Frank and Wade Phillips and E.W. Marland, who started Conoco, and J. Paul Getty and Bill Skelly. Those people literally changed our world. Hydraulic fracturing was invented in Oklahoma in 1949. We were the first to commercialize an oil well. The shale revolution was really developed by technology that was championed by the folks at Chesapeake and Devon Energy in Oklahoma. And we can do that innovation not only in the oil and gas space, but in alternative energy. We're still very proud of our history as a leader in the traditional oil and gas liquid space. We're number 4 in the production of natural gas nationwide, and we're number 5 in oil. But really, that's not what's really kind of driving the market today. Those things continue, and we see that continuing for a long time. But most people are surprised to know that we are already at 50% of renewable energy for our power sector. The power we consume is about 50% renewable. So people are shocked to hear that. And yes, we have a tremendous wind resource in Oklahoma, but we also have a great solar resource. And we've got a reliable hydroelectric fleet that produces about 3 to 6% of our power, and we're proud of that as well. So we're leading on uptake of renewables. And people say, well, how can Oklahoma do renewables so well? Well, number one, it's partly because of resources. And number two, it's because of natural gas. So the reason we can put so much renewable on the grid without it costing us excessive amounts is because when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine, we can dispatch immediate power at the same or similar cost because of our low-cost natural gas. And, we're really low on, we don't produce coal in Oklahoma to any degree. So when we burn coal at a coal plant, we have to get it from your former state, Wyoming, and the Powder River Basin. And, we are proud that we have the reliability of coal on the grid when we need it. We experienced that in Winter Storm Uri. We can talk about that later, but I think those are kind of the things that really surprise people, is that we've really diversified our grid. And if you think about what renewable energy does to carbon reduction and criteria pollutant reduction, and natural gas does in the same way, we have remarkable emissions reduction. We've reduced our carbon using the Biden benchmark of 2005. The national average since 2005 as of 2018 was 12%. In Oklahoma, it's 36%. We've eclipsed that, and I think we'll be closer to 50 now because we keep adding renewables at a very, very quick pace.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. Last summer, Ken, you announced the launch of Oklahoma's Hydrogen Production, Transport, and Infrastructure Task Force. And then in December, the task force issued a report describing this great potential for Oklahoma to participate in the hydrogen economy. So what's driving your state's, and if I'm reading it right, kind of your own personal interest in the hydrogen economy?
Well, so in 2020, our governor's big on setting goals, right? Set a goal, refresh those goals, and then have milestones reporting at how you're coming close to it. And I stood up at the beginning of 2020 and said that my number one goal for my cabinet was to attract $1 billion of investment in hydrogen. and that hydrogen would be my number one priority during my continued time as Secretary of Energy and Environment. And I will tell you that they looked at me like I was an alien.
You're used to that, though, right?
Yeah,
that was a lot.
And then I explained to them why this is such an incredible opportunity for Oklahoma. And then 2 years later, now that the infrastructure bill has passed and we've surpassed the $1 billion of investment, direct investment into Oklahoma on hydrogen, I look a lot smarter than I did in 2020. And part of that's luck, but part of it is just getting involved with a couple of companies that were early on looking to locate in Oklahoma, and me, the light kind of going on in my head of, oh, this could be really big. And so it starts with geographic location. The circumference or radius around a hydrogen production plant that makes it viable is about 300 miles, 300 to 400 miles. Well, if you think about the access to markets in that 300 to 400 miles, you've got most of the Texas market, you've got St. Louis, you've got Kansas City, you've got the Arkansas market, and we're the closest to Denver. So we set up this really strong geographical location. And then you think, well, that certainly we have 4 interstates that go through our state. So we're really strong crossroads of America kind of appeal. So if you're looking at over-the-road trucking, we're a natural place to do that. And then you think about what are the 2 ways to make hydrogen. Electrolyzed hydrogen, that hydrogen which is generally sought as green, but made with renewable energy that actually uses water as its feedstock. Electrolyzers separate the water, the hydrogen from the oxygen, and you vent the oxygen. That is green hydrogen.
Okay, that sounds pretty green.
It is.
Right?
It is green.
Your byproduct is oxygen, right?
Yep.
So, but it also sounds a little bit water intensive. And finally, we get to the water portion of the water podcast.
Yeah. All right. Well, but 80% of the cost of making hydrogen is power. So that's going to always be one of the main inputs. But water is a significant input
on the green hydrogen.
On the green hydrogen
piece.
On any hydrogen, it would be pink too, right? If you were using nuclear energy to produce, so any low cost electricity that is carbon free, that produces uses the electricity to make hydrogen would fit that category of water intensity. And so, if you're producing it on the eastern part of the state, in Oklahoma, water's not a problem, right? The 98th meridian cuts Oklahoma, separating the arid, semi-arid parts of the country from those that are considered to have an abundance of water. So that's really right through the middle of our state. But the renewable energy is really in the areas of our state that doesn't have substantial water or enough water. And so we see that the opportunity is really around recycling of water. And Dave, I hear you've been involved in that.
Yeah, I have a deep interest in reuse of water, and that is that's what I would really want to get at, because this is the Reflections on Water podcast. The water scarcity issues that we're looking at, and particularly in the parts of the state where you're developing the renewable energy to provide the power source, the cheap power source. But what is your plan for developing sustainable water to the hydrogen economy if it develops the way you hope in Oklahoma?
So immediately when we talk to these companies, we start trying to identify, looking at where they're located and what industry is there, right? So we've got fertilizer production and they all use cooling water, right? And so there's those that pull water, groundwater, use it into cooling and then discharge to surface water. Well, that would be, it's pretty clean, it's treated. That water would be suitable for production of hydrogen. People, obviously we have a tremendous potential resource in the produced water. So produced water from oil and gas activities. Right now that's waste, right? And we've worked significantly to start reusing that in the oil field. And so we're about 50% of that now gets reused. The other 50% primarily gets injected in saltwater disposal wells. You've heard of the underground injection control program?
Yeah, Anna and I may have had that under our portfolio in a former position, so I'm glad you threw that out there. But that is, and I do want to stay on the hydrogen topic, and there are a few other points, but let's talk about the produced water for just a second. I know Oklahoma passed a law in the last couple of years trying to kind of clean up some of the legal questions about ownership of produced water and the liability associated with that. Do you see that, or are there other things that the state can do to accelerate the beneficial reuse and the wise reuse of produced water? Because you really do have a ton of it.
Yeah, so I think there's a tremendous appetite to do that at the state policy level, the tribal level, community level. There's a lot of work being done in and around how do we get that water clean enough to use for some beneficial reuse other than just back in the oil patch. And it's got tremendous amounts of brine, right? Tremendous amounts of salt. And so that's the first thing you got to. And then we put in for state delegation on produced water discharge, so the NPDES program. And I will tell you, of all the things that I've done in my nearly 4 years as secretary, that's the one that generated the most mail. People calling and writing saying, don't frack our water. It's like, look, I grew up on these streams. We're not going to do anything until we know it's safe, right? But if you don't start doing the R&D at the point in time you need that water, it's too late.
So right now, it's a resource that we are putting back down in deep well injection, through the aquifer groundwater injection program.
Yep.
But it's taking a resource and we're locking it away for future generations, that we could be beneficially reusing right now. But effectively, it's fit for purpose. And so part of it, in my experience, is if you figure out how to use produced water, does it enable more production of the carbon-intensive resource?
I think there's a lot of people that think that. And really all we're doing is meeting demand. I mean, that's, ultimately policymakers think that they can control how much oil and gas we produce or that, when in fact all we can really do is affect supply, right? Demand drives ultimately, and that's all Oklahoma is trying to do, is to in the most environmentally sensitive way meet the demand of our country.
Let's talk about those underground injection wells a little bit more.
Yeah.
Because we just talked about them in the context of your produced water and how we're sort of burying this potential resource underground. Those UIC wells are critical for another piece of this puzzle, aren't they, Ken?
Including hydrogen, right?
Yes. And that is for the carbon sequestration, capture sequestration piece.
And so we only talked about green hydrogen, right? And that's a great segue into, that's why you did it. You're the host. But it's a great segue into that we are fuel agnostic in Oklahoma. We really are. So we want a fair and equal playing field for all fuel sources and people to develop all fuel sources. So even though hydrogen is that thing that I think is the tie that binds, it's the first time that you can put oil and gas industry in the room with renewable industry, and they actually collaborate because they have similar goals to create this economy and this ecosystem. That doesn't happen. And through this task force, they did that. We have certainly spent a great deal of time characterizing the geologic formations that would be suitable. That's the other part about why hydrogen is important in Oklahoma. The other way to make it is by taking methane, carbon, and 4 molecules of hydrogen make up methane. So currently 95% of all hydrogen that's used in industrial processes made from natural gas and steam, in a process called steam methane reforming. And that's what we call gray hydrogen, where you just vent the carbon dioxide. Most people don't know that when you take that one carbon molecule and those 4 hydrogen molecules and they split, when you get a metric ton of hydrogen, you get 9 tons of carbon dioxide.
Hey, by the way, Anna, did you know Ken was going to talk chemistry to us today, or I'm just sort of
I don't know.
blown away at this moment?
I don't know, Ken.
This is I actually talked to the Society of Geophysicists. I'm like, I have science teachers rolling in their grave right now.
Did you take a lot of notes? You were talking to them about this? You were teaching them?
Yes. I'm like, this is the talk no one saw coming. So that's a problem. And so let's talk transportation to benchmark this for your listeners. If you're $3 a gallon for petroleum products, whether it's diesel or gas, gray hydrogen at the gallon equivalent is about $3. So, apples to apples, but you get this highly carbon intense
emission byproduct.
So not something that the country's looking for right now. So when you add blue, which is adding carbon capture, sequestration to that mix, the cost goes to about $5 with the 45Q tax credit. When you look at green, it goes to about 12. And the problem with green is not the use of renewable energy. It's the fact that the electrolyzers today are so expensive. And so we could cite renewable production of hydrogen all around our state easily if they could just use stranded energy. By that I mean wind blows when demand is very low, typically at night, and those electrons are simply wasted. They go back onto the grid as congestion, and sometimes they actually have to pay the utility to take that energy back. So if you could take those electrons, produce hydrogen when nobody else is using them, it's virtually free, then the cost of that goes way down. The problem is you can't pay for your electrolyzers over that, but it's just a tremendous way to store energy, right? It's a battery. So those wasted electrons put into liquid hydrogen, stored in underground storage or above ground, and you've saved them for another day.
Let's talk about the blue version of hydrogen and the carbon sequestration.
The carbon sequestration.
Yeah. So Ann and I have spent a little bit of time, thinking about Class 6 UIC wells. That you've talked about.
So have I.
Yeah, and you've talked about this infrastructure bill a couple times. There's a lot of federal money now aiming at carbon sequestration to try to get to a deployment of technology. Yeah. Where are you guys at? What are the impediments that you see to carbon sequestration in Oklahoma, at least?
Right, and they're regulatory. They're regulatory. To kind of set the stage for what we're seeing, the industry, the state, are tremendously excited about the opportunities that the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the funding that came through that, afford. You've got $10 billion just on CCUS, I think $10 billion. And then you've got $30 billion for demonstration of hydrogen. And as I've just talked about, part of that involves carbon sequestration. And then there's another part that involves carbon removal technologies or direct air capture, literally fans blowing and pulling carbon from ambient air. Well, you got to do something with that carbon. It's a great technology, but most of that's going to involve either utilization or storing it in deep geologic storage. And so, you've got $40 billion that are going to touch around CCUS. And you guys know this well. How many permits in the history of EPA have been granted on Class 6 or deep geological storage?
One, not enough. Very few, right?
Like
Very
4.
few. It's a handful. Yeah. It's a handful.
And so to know that with the 45Q tax credit, which is a Treasury tax credit that gives $50 a ton for deep geologic storage and $35 a ton for enhanced soil recovery, that $50 now $85 after the infrastructure bill, that is incentivizing people to go and start buying land, planning to do these deep injection wells. And and I know, there's very few people in the country that can actually do this. And there's only 2 states with primacy. And that's not all at headquarters. That's not all in one region. That's spread throughout the entire country. And so if you think about the amount of modeling, the amount of work that goes into an injection well, particularly one of first impression, right? Because they don't have the history like they do with class 2 or some other class 3 or whatever it is. So I see that being the bottleneck substantially. And that's not to be critical of EPA. You know as well as I do that EPA just can't move people around, and they can't hire without Congress acting.
But they can approve state programs to administer the program. You mentioned there are 2 states that have delegation for the program. Is that something that Oklahoma is pursuing?
We are. And the infrastructure bill also puts $50 million for states to build capacity and move towards state primacy. $50 million. And so, yeah, right now, North Dakota and Wyoming are the only 2 states. You may have signed those applications and approving those primacy programs. Louisiana is the next on the list. And I can tell you there is great consternation about why that program hasn't been approved. Today, there was a hearing at Energy and Natural Resources on hydrogen. I got to watch part of it. And Senator Cassidy may have lit into a witness about why that program hasn't been approved. He made the point that Louisiana, in preparation for primacy, has 26 geologists at the Department of Natural Resources, and Region 6 has 6.
Well, that's the point of delegation, is use the states as the accelerators, as the regulators. You get the high level expertise, the framework that's set up at EPA, and then the states come in with their individual expertise, like Louisiana that you just mentioned. So how do we think about changing or getting rid of some of those impediments, or maybe potentially accelerating deployment? Is it trying to get EPA more funding? Is it what is it? What is it, Ken?
It's both. I think you have to have buy-in from both sides of the government. You got, the one hand, the Biden administration pushing all these clean energy and environmental programs, and then the regulatory side, which is typically not involved in the funding, with the exception of clean water SRFs, right, and drinking water SRFs, water infrastructure. They're typically not involved in the funding. And so they don't really get the memo from the other hand that says, hey, you're about to be inundated with these applications. You need to coordinate the staffing. And Congress doesn't think that way. They think, we can catalyze this industry. We can catalyze clean energy. We can develop jobs. But they don't think about the regulatory process and that includes NEPA, right? It includes Section 106, historical preservation, fish and wildlife, endangered species, all of the things that you as lawyers have to deal with in helping clients get permitted.
Yeah, Ken, we agree with you that as a long list of regulatory programs that we saw, working with the state of Florida to take, for example, the 404 program, right? And it's a big lift in state delegation, but with state leaders like you who've served in both the federal and state government, you sort of understand how that works. So, thanks for bringing that up for us.
That's a great transition, Dave. I do want to move a little bit in this conversation, Ken, because you actually are a lawyer yourself. You've been practicing law for 60, 70 years now?
I still self-identify as a lawyer. I do. But it was just like 26 years.
Okay, all right, close. So. I was close. But the majority of your career, really, you spent in private practice, and then you transitioned into federal service at EPA, and then into state service with Governor Stitt. What's been the most interesting or surprising thing you've encountered in your transition from federal to state government?
I think the partisan politics at the state level are so much less. You really can get in the room with both sides, and while they might talk in front of a camera a little differently, they really do want to see goals accomplished. A good idea is just a good idea. It's not because you came up with it or somebody on the other side came up with it. It's a good idea. And you can look past the fact that it was their idea. We had a meeting at NASIO today, and we were meeting with EPA about they sent some people over to talk to states about a new 111D rule on the Clean Air Act, on greenhouse gases from the power sector. And we made a statement to them about things, and the gentleman from New York, my New York counterpart in the state energy office, said, for the record, New York agrees with Oklahoma. So we can get along, and we can agree on process, and that sometimes this flip-flopping is really not productive, and that goes for both sides.
Yeah, no question about that. All right, well, I think we're about to wrap up here. Ken, is there anything else you wanna share?
I think you're going to see just so much opportunity in the water space around water infrastructure. I mean, Bruno Piggott, whom we know from both EPA and that, is the principal. I think he's the principal deputy in the Office of Water, and Bruno is just first of all, he's a wonderful person, and we've gotten to interact with him, and he's serious about getting this money to states to deploy through our clean water SRF, state revolving funds, and our drinking water SRFs, to really deploy them. And their goals and our goals really match on environmental justice. We haven't talked about that, but
actually, let's talk environmental justice in Oklahoma.
Yeah, so I've had this conversation at all levels of the Biden administration, and I've talked to Michael Regan personally about it. And I said, with the governor and Administrator Regan, look, we don't have the traditional post-industrial, you think about Gary, Indiana, and that hub around the Great Lakes, where you've got plants shut down and then still operating with significant emissions, in communities that live close by, right? Because they can't move away. We don't have a Gulf Coast petrochemical corridor where there are fence line communities that have grown up around that. But what we do have is a tremendous amount of space and rural communities where time and economic development have passed them by. And so you can loan them all the money at 0% in the world, but it'll still raise their water bill by 3 times. And I think other states are in that same boat. And so, that, I think there is certainly a podcast around that for you guys at some point. And then really just around the entire infrastructure law, well plugging for us, we're going to get nearly $300 million. The first tranche, we got 78, I think.
And that's for plugging old.
That is for plugging
oil
old
and gas wells.
Historic legacy oil and gas wells. We have cataloged 17,000 of those in Oklahoma, and that's not to clean up the well sites. That's to simply plug and clean up the fugitive emissions. And if there's leakage, seepage to water, I mean, both surface water and groundwater, this is a historic opportunity to do that. So we're excited about that. People go, well, why do you care about direct air capture in Oklahoma? Well, because if you think about fans pulling air into the collection system, it requires energy. We have the cheapest energy in the country and the cleanest. And so that's important to us. But of the 3 direct air capture units that are operating in the world today, one of which was engineered and fabricated in Sapulpa, Oklahoma, we have that expertise because of our oil and gas workforce. It's the same type of compression, same type of vacuum units, same type of collection units. And so that's why it's important to us.
It sounds like it's an absolutely fantastic time, an exciting time to serve as a cabinet secretary overseeing energy environment in Oklahoma. Ken, we watched your career. We are extremely proud of the work that you're doing, and really appreciative of you taking the time to join us. Thanks a lot. If you have any closing words for us and for our listeners?
Just, we appreciated your service, both of you, to distinguished service to the country. And, a lot of the programs that you set up are still in place. The water sub-cabinet and the water reuse action plan, we were thankful to be a part of the original kickoff of that. And so I'm glad to see you guys thriving in the private sector.
It's great to see you, Ken. Thanks again for coming.
All right. Thanks, Ken. We appreciate it.
Copyright Troutman Pepper Hamilton Sanders, LLP. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including, without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepper. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.